Alright, in this video we're going to talk real quick about how to use a scientific or a graphing calculator to evaluate trig functions. So the first major thing, which is up here in capital letters and underlined a couple times, when you're doing this unit circle type stuff and you're dealing with these t values that are in terms of like the pi numbers, pi over 6, 5 pi over 3 or whatever, your calculator has to be in radian mode in order for it to calculate these things correctly. So any scientific or graphing calculator, you can switch between two modes, the radian mode and the degree mode. Right? Degree mode is what you use when you're doing trigonometry with angles that are measured in degrees, which is something I'll be doing videos on sometime along the way here. But when you're using the unit circle and you're using these pi numbers, you want to have your calculator in radian mode. Right, and when I do the examples in a couple of minutes, I'll show you, at least on my calculator, how to change the mode. But for any scientific and graphing calculator, there is a way to change your mode. Most of them have a button that says mode, which allows you to change the mode. All right, so on most scientific calculators and graphing calculators, well, let me rephrase that. All scientific and graphing calculators have three trig functions on there. They all have the sine function, the cosine function, and the tangent function. Right, so every scientific and graphing calculator will have those three. Now, if you have a fancier type of calculator, you might have the other three on there as well, but most scientific and graphing calculators only have those first three, the sine, cosine, and tangent. So, if you need to use your calculator to evaluate the other three trig functions, the cosecant, the secant, or the cotangent, you use the reciprocal relationships. Right, and the video that I did on the definitions of the trig functions, one of the things I mentioned, which was important to know, is like which one is the reciprocal of the other. Remember, the first three, the sine, cosine, and tangent, those are the main three trig functions, but the other three are reciprocals of the first three. Right, so the cosecant function is the reciprocal of the sine function. It's 1 over sine t. So if I need to find the cosecant of a number in my calculator, I do 1 divided by sine of that number, and then that gives me the cosecant. Right, the secant of t is the reciprocal of cosine. It's 1 over the cosine of t. Right, and then cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. Right, so if I need to calculate the cotangent of a number, I do 1 divided by the tangent of that number, and that gives me the cotangent. Right, so in order to use your calculator, again, sine, cosine, and tangent, really simple. Your calculator will have a button for those, as long as you're able to find that button, as long as you're in the correct mode. And then for the other ones, if you have to use a calculator, you need to know these reciprocal relationships, which one is the reciprocal of the other, in order to get those correct. All right, so really, really important to know those reciprocal relationships. I'm going to pause this recording, erase this, and then put up a couple quick examples where I'll show you how to punch the stuff in the calculator to evaluate these trig functions. Alright, so I put 4 examples up here that we'll look at real quick. But first thing, when we're going to use our calculator to evaluate these trig functions using the pi numbers, we have to be in radian mode. So for my calculator, which is a TI-84, and if you have a TI-83, it's in the format is the same. The mode button I have is right next to the second button at the top. So if you hit that mode button, and then if you look on the third line there, right, it says radian and degree, and if you notice, mine right now is in degree mode, so I'm going to have to change that. So I have to hit the down button until I get to the radian mode, hit enter, and now the radian is highlighted, so now my calculator is in radian mode, and it will do these appropriately. Right, so that's how you can check. So that mode button right there. Now, if you have a different type of calculator, there's a way to change between radians and degrees, so you might have to search around and find it, or like read the instruction manual for your calculator in order to figure out how to change the mode. But for these, you have to make sure you're in radian mode. So make sure you're able to do that before you go too much further with trigonometry. Because for some trigonometry, we need to be in radian mode. For other trigonometric problems, we're going to have to be in degree mode. So it's one of those things we're going to have to switch back and forth as we go further and further in trigonometry. And sometimes this is from one problem to the next. Oh, this problem's in degrees, but the next one's in radian, so I got to switch my calculator to the proper mode. So you got to be able to find that and know how to do that pretty quickly and easily. All right. So if I want to find sine of 2.2, so again, on this calculator, on the TI-83 or 84 calculator, the sine, cosine, and tangent buttons are all right next to each other. So you can see right here, sine, cosine, tangent, right, all three of those right next to each other. So if I want to do sine of 2.2, I just hit that sine button. It gives me the sine with the open parentheses. I can type in 2.2 and then close parentheses, and then when I hit enter, I get the value for the sine of 2.2, which is 0.80849 and so on. So sine of 2.2 equals 0.8 0.08496, let's say. All right, so that's the value of sine of 2.2. Now, before we go any further with this, just a note. If you watch the other videos that I did about evaluating trig functions and using the unit circle to evaluate trig functions, that's our preferred method for evaluating trig functions, but that doesn't always work, right? To use the unit circle to evaluate the trig functions, the number we're looking for here, the t value that we're plugging in, has to be a pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2 number, or some multiple of those in order for us to be able to find it on the unit circle, right? 2.2 is not pi over 6, it's not 5 pi over 3, it's not any of those things. So anytime I have to evaluate a trig function that's not one of those ones that I know on the unit circle, or one of those ones that I know from my trig hand, or a multiple of one of those, then I have to use my calculator to evaluate the function. Right, so for a lot of trigonometry, you will be relying on your calculator to get your solutions to your problems. Right, the only time you use the unit circle is if you're using, 7 pi over 6 or 5 pi over 4 or those nice numbers with the pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. Right, for any other number, you're using the calculator. All right, so sine of 2.2 is that number we have up there. Cosine of 1.1. Right, so the cosine button I just showed you a minute ago, right there next to the sine button, COS. So I hit cosine, I type in 1.1, and you don't even have to close the parentheses on these if you don't want to, if you want to be lazy about it. And we get 0.4535, whatever. So I got 0.453596. All right, so that's the value of cosine of 1.1, right? Again, 1.1 is not one of those pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2 numbers, so we got to use the calculator for it. All right, next one, cotangent of 28. All right, so I look at my calculator and I don't have a cotangent button, right? I have sine, I have cosine, I have tangent. I don't have cotangent. So in order to calculate cotangent of 28, again, 28 is not one of those numbers I recognize from the unit circle, so I need to use my reciprocal properties. Cotangent is the reciprocal of the tangent function. So cotangent of 28 is going to be 1 over tangent of 28. And let me try to write that so hopefully you all can read it. All right, so it's 1 over tangent 28. I tried to rewrite that. It still looks pretty sloppy, but I'm not going to do it again. All right, so 1 over tangent 28. Now, one thing I do want to point out here, because sometimes people get confused about that. So if you look at my tangent button, right, above that tangent button in blue, it says tangent with that -1 exponent. That doesn't mean 1 over tangent, right? That tangent -1 is not going to be cotangent, right? That tangent -1, you see the same thing over the cosine and the sine. It has the sine -1, cosine -1. That's for the inverse sine, cosine, and tangent functions, which is not the same as cotangent, right? The reciprocal is not the same as the inverse, right? Inverse functions is something that I'll talk about in another video, the inverse trig functions. But if I'm looking to do 1 divided by tangent, I don't do that -1 exponent thing. I do 1 over, like literally 1 divided by tangent of 28. Right, so you have to type it in like that. 1 divided by tangent 28, hit enter, and we get the value for cotangent of 28, which is -3.553286448. Not that we need all those decimals there, so -3.553. And let's just call it there because I ran out of space on the board to write any more numbers. All right, so that's our cotangent of 28. I have to use the reciprocal property to figure that out. Same idea for cosecant of 0.98, right? I don't have a cosecant button on my calculator, but cosecant is the reciprocal of the sine function. So cosecant of 0.98 is 1 over the sine of 0.98. All right, so I go to my calculator, I do 1 divided by sine 0.98, just to show you what that looks like. All right, so 1 divided by sine 0.98, hit the enter, and I get 1.20409777. So 1.2041, let's round that to. All right, so that is how we can evaluate trig functions using our calculators. Again, key things, calculator in radian mode. For now, how you would know to use degree mode, if this, instead of sine 2.2, if it has 2.2 degrees, if it had that little degree symbol on it, Now you have to change your calculator to degree mode in order to evaluate that. But if you don't see that degree symbol, then you assume that you're working with radians and your calculator has to be in radian mode. All right, so first thing, make sure your calculator's in radian mode. And then sine, cosine, and tangent, you just hit those buttons and type in the numbers. Pretty simple. For the other three, you have to know those reciprocal relationships and do 1 divided by one of those other three, either sine, cosine, or tangent, in order to get those other three, the cotangent, the cosecant, or the secant functions. All right, so that's using your calculator to evaluate the trig functions.